The rain had soaked through her jacket 2 miles back, and still her hands would not stop shaking. Not from the cold, from the signing. Marin's fingers had held the pen the way a person holds the edge of a ledge, too tight, too aware of the fall below, and now the ink was still drying on a contract she had read 3 times and understood on the 4th. A residence arrangement, room and board in exchange for cataloguing a private library. That was what it said on paper. What it meant in practice was that she had walked into a stranger's house at 11 o'clock at night, because the only other option was the car she had been sleeping in for 9 days. And before that, the apartment where the deadbolt had been removed from the inside of the bedroom door on a Tuesday while she was at work. She did not think about the deadbolt. She had trained herself not to think about it, the way she had trained herself not to flinch when someone reached past her for a glass. The flinch was still there. It lived in the muscles of her shoulders, a permanent brace. She had stopped noticing the way a person stops noticing. The sound of traffic outside a window they never open. The house was old in the way that money used to build things. Not preserved, but endured. Stone walls the colour of wet slate. Hallways wider than the apartment she had shared with Caleb, which was not difficult because in that apartment she could stand in the kitchen and touch both walls if she stretched. She had measured it once, arm span plus 4 inches. She remembered the number the way she remembered the sound of his keys in the lock, involuntarily, with her whole body. Elias had met her at the door himself. No staff, no intermediary, no one to buffer the strangeness of the transaction. He was taller than she had expected from the photograph attached to the listing, a university archive site, the kind of thing that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. His face was the same but sharper in person, as if someone had taken a portrait and removed all the softness that a camera lens adds by default. Dark hair threaded with grey at the temples, though his face carried no lines that suggested the age the grey implied. His eyes were the brown of old wood, and they held the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from sleeplessness, but from having been awake too long in a larger sense. He showed her the room, 3rd floor, east wing, a bed made with military precision and a window that looked out over a garden she could not see in the dark, but could smell, boxwood and something floral she could not name. The lock was on the inside. She checked before he finished speaking. He noticed that she checked and said nothing about it, which told her more than any reassurance would have. She asked where the library was. He said he would show her in the morning. She asked what time she should be ready. He said whenever she woke. She asked if there were parts of the house she should avoid. He paused at that, and in the pause she catalogued everything she could read from his posture. The careful distance he kept, the hands clasped behind his back, as if to prove they were accounted for, the way he turned his body slightly away from the door frame so she would never feel blocked in. He told her the house was hers to move through freely. Every room, every corridor, every staircase. The only locked door was his study on the ground floor, and even that he would unlock if she asked. She did not ask. She watched him leave, listened to his footsteps descend 2 flights of stairs, heard the distant sound of a door closing, not a slam, not even firm, just the quiet click of a latch engaging as if it were apologizing for the noise. Marin sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat against her thighs, the way she did when she needed to confirm she was in a body and the body was somewhere specific and the somewhere was not the apartment with the removed deadbolt. The sheets smelled like lavender. The radiator ticked. The rain continued against the window with the steady patience of something that intended to last all night. She made herself breathe. She made herself catalogue the room. Bed, nightstand, lamp, wardrobe, window, door, lock. The lock was a deadbolt, heavy, brass, the kind that required intention to open from either side. She engaged it, and the sound it made was the first thing that had felt solid in 9 days. The arrangement was for 6 months. She could leave at any time. That clause was written into the contract in language so plain it felt deliberate, as if whoever had drafted it understood that ambiguity was a weapon and had disarmed the document on purpose. Maren had read contracts before. Caleb's lease had contained 14 clauses she hadn't understood until the day she tried to leave and found out that leaving cost more than staying. This contract contained none of that architecture. It was a door, not a wall, and the difference sat in her chest like something she did not have a name for yet. She slept that night for 4 hours, which was more than she had slept in any single stretch since the deadbolt. She woke once at 3 in the morning to a sound she could not identify. A low, drawn-out exhale from somewhere below her, as if the house itself were breathing. She lay still and listened. It did not come again. In the morning she found coffee already made in the kitchen. A French press, still warm, and beside it a cup, not set out in the centre of the counter where it might feel like an expectation, but placed near the edge, close to the door, where someone passing through could take it or not take it without feeling observed. She took it. The coffee was strong and unsweetened, and the cup was ceramic, heavy, the kind that had been made by a hand rather than a machine. She held it with both hands and let the heat move through her fingers and tried to remember the last time someone had made coffee for her without being asked. She could not remember. That was not the same as it never happening. It was the specific erasure that comes from years of recalibrating what counts as kindness until the threshold is so high that ordinary warmth falls below it, unregistered and uncounted. The library was on the 2nd floor. Elias was already there when she arrived, standing beside a shelf that reached the ceiling, his hand resting on the spine of a book, the way someone rests a hand on the shoulder of an old friend. He turned when she entered, and something happened that she would not understand for 3 more days. He extended his hand, a handshake, formal, almost old-fashioned, the kind of gesture that belonged to a century she had only read about. She took it, and the world split open. Pain arrived like a wall of sound, not sharp, not localized, but everywhere at once. A blade across the ribs, fire along the left forearm, something deep and crushing in the chest, the kind of pressure that comes from a wound that never fully healed. The sensations stacked on top of each other so fast she could not separate them. A cut that had gone to bone, a burn that had taken months to close, a fracture that had been set wrong and set again. The particular blunt agony of a body that had been hurt more times than a body should survive and had survived anyway, over and over for longer than she could process. She dropped his hand, the pain vanished, every trace of it gone like a door slamming shut on a room full of noise. Elias had not moved, his expression had not changed, but his hand, the hand she had just released, hung in the air for 1 second longer than it should have, as if he had felt something too, and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. He didn't. He said good morning. He showed her the cataloguing system. He explained the organization method he had tried and abandoned, the sections that needed the most attention, the volumes that were fragile and required gloves. His voice was even and careful, the voice of a man who had learned long ago that steadiness was a form of courtesy. Maren nodded in the right places. She asked the right questions. She picked up the first book and opened it and began noting the condition of the binding and the clarity of the print and the date on the title page, which read 1796. And inside her chest, beneath the professional composure and the careful distance she kept from every living thing, a question had taken root that would not leave her alone for the rest of the day or the week or the month. What she had felt when she touched him was not metaphor. It was not panic. It was not her own body misfiring from stress or sleeplessness or the residue of years spent bracing for impact. It was his every wound, every scar, every injury he had ever survived, arriving in her body all at once like a history, delivered in the only language that cannot lie. She did not touch him again for 6 days. She was not sure she could survive it twice. The first week passed like that, careful and quiet, two people learning not to startle each other. Maren worked in the library from 8 until 6, breaking only when hunger demanded it, and even then she ate quickly, standing at the kitchen counter like someone who had learned that sitting down to a meal was a luxury that could be revoked. She catalogued 312 books in those 6 days. She knew the number because counting was what she did when the world became too large or too unpredictable. She reduced it to numbers, to inventories, to things that could be verified and repeated. Elias was in the house. She always knew where he was, the way a person who has lived with danger always knows where the nearest exit is and who is closest to it. He moved through the rooms with a deliberateness she had not seen in anyone before. Not slow, not cautious, but intentional, as if every step were chosen rather than automatic. She began to notice that he never appeared in doorways. He would stop 3 feet back, wait, let her register his presence before he moved closer. The first time she noticed it, she thought it was coincidence. The fourth time, she understood it was a system, and the system was designed entirely around her comfort, and he had never mentioned it. The flowers changed on the 3rd day. A small vase on the kitchen windowsill that she had barely noticed. White flowers she could not identify, slightly wilted. She came down for coffee on the 3rd morning and they were fresh. Different variety. Pale pink, small petaled. The kind that smelled like morning. She looked at them for a long time, the way she used to look at the level of coffee in her father's cup when the bills were late. Her father's cup had been a measure of how bad things were. Full meant he was coping. Half meant the anxiety had started. Empty and unwashed in the sink meant the shut-off notices had arrived. She had been 7 when she learned to read a coffee cup like a weather forecast. She had been 7 and she had stood in the kitchen doorway counting the inches of liquid left and calculating, with a precision no child should possess, how many days until the fear arrived. The flowers in Elias's kitchen were not a warning system. They were replaced because they were wilting, and someone in this house cared about a small thing remaining alive and beautiful in a room where another person might see it. The simplicity of that, an act of maintenance performed for no reason other than that someone thought it mattered, sat with Maren the way a pebble sits in a shoe. Present, impossible to ignore, not painful exactly, but reshaping the way she walked. She began cataloguing him the same way she catalogued the books. Observations recorded silently, filed by frequency and significance. He read in the evenings, always in the same armchair in the library's west corner, positioned where the lamplight fell on the page without casting his shadow across hers. He drank tea, never coffee, always from the same cup, porcelain so thin she could see the ghost of his fingers through it. He ate alone but left the kitchen door open, as if the sound of her footsteps above was company enough and he did not want to wall it off. He asked her nothing about her past, not where she came from, not what she had left, not why a woman with a master's degree in library science was answering anonymous listings for live-in cataloguing work at 11 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday. The absence of those questions was louder than any interrogation would have been. He knew. He had read it on her the way she had read it on her father's coffee cup. The posture, the flinch, the too fast breathing when a door closed unexpectedly. He knew and he had decided that knowledge would live in the way he moved through the house rather than in anything he said. On the 9th day, she brushed past him in the 2nd floor hallway. Not intentional. The corridor narrowed where the shelving jutted out, and she had turned a corner without seeing him there. Her arm grazed his, fabric against fabric, barely a second of contact. The wounds came again, fewer this time, or perhaps she was more prepared for them. A deep ache in the left shoulder. Old and familiar, the kind that comes from carrying something too heavy for too long. A thin line of fire across the back of the right hand. A defensive wound, the kind a person gets when they raise their hand to protect their face. And beneath both of those, something that was not exactly pain but felt like it. A vast, low, steady pressure in the center of his chest that she recognized because she carried it herself. Loneliness, not the temporary kind, the kind that had calcified into structure. The kind a body builds around when the feeling has been present so long it becomes load-bearing, and removing it would mean the whole architecture collapses. She pulled away, he stepped back, neither of them spoke. She walked to the library and sat down in front of a shelf of 18th century botanical texts and opened the first volume and stared at an engraving of a root system without seeing it, because the only thing she could see was the map of damage inside a man who moved through his own home as if he were trying not to take up space in it. That night she could not sleep. Not from fear. For the first time since arriving, the insomnia was not about hypervigilance. It was about something else, something she could not place. A quality of attention that felt new and uncomfortable, like wearing a coat that fits but belongs to someone else. She got up at 2 a.m. and went to the kitchen. The light was on. Elias was sitting at the table with a book open in front of him, but his eyes were not on the page. They were on the window, on the darkness beyond it, on something she could not see that seemed to exist at a distance she could not measure. She almost turned around. The instinct was automatic. Retreat, avoid, make yourself small. But something held her. The quality of his stillness, the way his hands lay flat on the table on either side of the book, as if he had set them down deliberately because they had nowhere else to go. She had seen that particular stillness before. She had lived inside it. It was the posture of a person sitting alone with a weight they had been carrying. So long they had stopped noticing it was heavy and would continue sitting there with it until morning came and gave them a reason to stand. She went in, she poured water from the filter on the counter. She sat down across from him, not close, not far, but at the distance that says, I see you sitting there and I am sitting here, and neither of us has to explain why. He looked at her. She looked at the cup of water in her hands. The silence held for a long time and neither of them filled it. She asked if he slept much. He said not for a long time. She asked how long. He said he could not remember the last time he slept through a full night without waking. His voice when he said it was matter of fact. The way someone describes the weather or the traffic, a condition of existence rather than a complaint. She told him she understood. She did not elaborate. She did not explain about the deadbolt or the keys or the precise sound of footsteps coming upstairs in the dark. She just said she understood, and the word landed between them like a stone settling in water. One small disruption, then stillness again, but the water was not the same. He closed his book. He wished her good night. He walked to the door and paused and said, without turning around, that if she ever needed anything in the night, anything, there was a bell in the hallway outside her room and he would hear it. He said it the way he said everything, carefully, without pressure, as if the information were a thing he was setting down on a surface, where she might pick it up if she wanted or leave it where it was if she didn't. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe. The radiators, the wind, the small sounds of an old building settling into its own weight. And for the first time, beneath the tick of the pipes and the rain on the stone, she thought she could hear something else. A heartbeat, slow, impossibly slow, steady as a tide. She pressed her hand flat against her own chest and felt two rhythms, her own, quick and wary and human, and beneath it, far away but unmistakable, the echo of his. The second week, she stopped counting the days. It happened in the library on a Thursday or perhaps a Friday. She had lost the habit of tracking, which was itself a kind of news. She was working on the east wall, the section Elias had warned her about. Fragile spines, foxed pages, some of the volumes so old that the leather had dried to the texture of autumn leaves. She wore the cotton gloves he had left for her in a box on the cataloguing desk, and she handled each book the way he seemed to handle everything, with a deliberateness that bordered on tenderness, as if the object in her hands had a history that deserved to be acknowledged before it was moved. She pulled a volume from the top shelf. A journal, she thought at first. The binding was wrong for a printed book. Too irregular, too personal. She opened it and found handwriting. Dense, slanted, the ink faded to the color of rust. The language was French, which she could read just well enough to understand the structure. Dates on the left margin, entries on the right, a span of months recorded in a hand that began steady and grew increasingly ragged as the pages turned. The last entry was dated 1843. The hand that wrote it was nearly illegible, the letters collapsing into each other as if the person writing had been in pain or in haste or both. She caught one word clearly, pardonner, to forgive, and below it in a different ink, darker, fresher, as if written years later by someone returning to a sentence they could not leave alone, jamais, never. She closed the journal and held it against her chest, and the feeling arrived without the touch. For the first time since the handshake, the wounds came not through skin contact, but through proximity alone, through holding something he had held, something that had lived against his hands, something that carried the residue of whatever he had been when he wrote that word in a different ink, on a different night, in a century she had never occupied. This time the pain was specific, a single wound, not the avalanche of the first encounter. A blade, she thought, low on the abdomen, left side, deep enough that the body remembered the direction of the entry and the specific quality of the cold that followed. Not temperature, but the cold of losing something internal, something warm leaving the body through a place it was never meant to leave. And around the wound, the ghost of hands pressing down. Not his hands, smaller hands. Someone trying to stop the bleeding, someone failing. Maren set the journal on the desk and sat very still and felt the wound close over the span of 30 seconds. Layer by layer, the way the body rebuilds. Tissue, then muscle, then skin. And when it was finished, she was breathing hard and her gloves were damp with sweat, and she understood something she had not understood before. The wounds she felt were not random. They were the ones that mattered. The handshake had delivered the whole catalogue, every injury, every scar, the complete inventory of a body that had endured more than any body should. But this was different. This was a single wound, delivered through an object, arriving with context. She had felt not just the pain but the hands, not just the injury but the aftermath, not just the damage but the love that tried to undo it and couldn't. Someone had held him while he bled, and he had survived, and they had not. And the journal's last entry was the proof, because the word pardonner was written in the same hand as the rest, and the word jamais was his. Years later, a man returning to a dead person's handwriting to answer a question that had never been asked. She did not mention it. She went back to work. She catalogued the journal under a designation she invented, personal/manuscript/pra-1900, and shelved it in the section she had reserved for items that did not fit the existing system, which was growing larger by the day. That evening, Elias found her in the kitchen. She was making soup, the first time she had cooked in this house, the first time she had used the stove, the first time she had opened the cabinets and touched the pots and moved through the kitchen as if she had a right to be there. The soup was nothing remarkable. Onion, potato, whatever was in the pantry. But the act of making it was the most territorial thing she had done since arriving, and both of them knew it. He asked if he could sit. She said yes. He sat at the table, not across from the stove, but to the side, at the angle where he could see her without watching her, where his presence was available but not surrounding. She had stopped noticing these calculations. They had become the geography of the house, the distances he kept, the angles he chose, the quiet engineering of a man who had learned that safety is not declared but constructed, one unrequired choice at a time. She asked him about the journal, not directly. She was not ready for directly. She asked if any of the books in the East Wall section were personal. He said some of them were. She asked how old the oldest one was. He was quiet for a long time, and in the quiet she could hear the soup bubbling and the rain beginning again, and the steady, impossible heartbeat beneath the floorboards that she had stopped questioning. He told her the oldest book in the collection had been purchased in 1691. He told her this the way he might have told her the time, factually, without drama, as if 3 centuries were a unit of measurement rather than an impossibility. She stirred the soup. She did not react. She had known in the way the body knows things the mind has not yet agreed to process. She had known since the handshake, since the weight of accumulated damage told her that no single lifetime could hold that many wounds, since the heartbeat beneath the house ticked at a speed that no human heart could sustain. She asked if the journal was his. He said yes. She asked about the last entry, not the word he had written, but the word that was already there. Pardonnez. She asked who had written it. He looked at her the way a person looks at a horizon they have been staring at for so long that they have stopped seeing it as distance and started seeing it as a wall. The expression held for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then it broke, not dramatically. He did not weep, he did not turn away, he did not perform grief. The break was quieter than that. It was a softening around the eyes, a release of the muscles in his jaw that she had not realized were clenched, a lowering of the guard so subtle that only someone who had spent years reading bodies for threat could have detected it. Her name was Odette, he said. She had been a physician's daughter in Lyon. She had found him in a field with a wound that should have killed him, and she spent 4 days keeping him alive, and on the 5th day she understood why the wound had not killed him, and she stayed anyway. She stayed for 11 years. She filled that journal with observations, his sleeping patterns, the speed of his healing, the way his body responded to silver and garlic and all the other superstitions she tested with a scientist's rigor and a lover's concern. The last entry was a request, that he forgive himself for surviving her, that he stop treating his own continuance as a debt owed to the dead. He had written Gemmaise beneath it in 1856, 13 years after she died. Maren turned off the stove. She ladled soup into 2 bowls. She set one in front of him and sat down with the other and said nothing, because the silence after a story like that is not empty. It is full. It is a space where the listener holds what they have received and lets it settle into the places where it fits. They ate together for the first time. The soup was unremarkable. The fact of the meal was not. After he cleared the dishes, he insisted quietly, the way he insisted on everything, with the particular courtesy of someone who understood that service freely given was the opposite of service, extracted by force. She stood in the doorway and said something she had not planned to say. She told him she could feel it, all of it, every wound. She told him about the handshake, about the hallway, about the journal. She told him that when she touched something he had touched, his pain arrived in her body like a letter she had not asked to receive, and she read it every time because she did not know how not to. He went very still, the kind of still that is not calm but the absence of all movement, the body holding its position because the mind behind it is processing something enormous and has not yet decided which direction to send the body in response. He asked if it hurt her. She said yes. He asked if she wanted him to stay away. She said she hadn't decided yet. He nodded. He did not step closer. He did not step back. He stood in the kitchen with the dishcloth in his hand and the single overhead light, casting shadows under his eyes that made him look every one of his centuries, and he waited for her to leave, because leaving was her prerogative and he would not take it from her by moving first. She left. She went upstairs. She locked the deadbolt. She lay in the dark and felt the phantom ache of a wound that had been stitched closed in 1843 by a woman named Odette, who had loved someone she could not save from time and had asked only that he forgive himself for being the one who remained. Maren pressed her palm flat against the mattress and felt the house breathing beneath her, slow and old and alive, and she thought, I am not afraid of this. She was not sure yet what she was instead, but the absence of fear was its own kind of beginning, and she let it be enough. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Maren had not experienced since before the apartment. Before Caleb, before the particular education of learning that a person who says they love you can also remove the lock from your door and call it a conversation about trust. The rhythm was simple. She worked in the library. Elias read or attended to correspondence she never asked about, or walked the grounds in the early evening with the unhurried gait of someone who knew every stone and root by memory. They ate together most nights now. Not every night, because Maren still needed the door closed sometimes, still needed the lock between them, still needed the fact of her own separateness, confirmed before she could choose connection again the next morning. Elias never asked about the nights she ate alone. He left food for her on those nights, a covered plate, a napkin, the small, precise kindness of a man who understood that withdrawal was not rejection, but maintenance. The supernatural connection, she had no better word for it, and she had tried several, changed as the weeks passed, not in kind, but in depth. In the beginning, touching him or his belongings had delivered the wound catalogue. The raw fact of damage, the body's inventory of everything it had survived. Now the data came with context. She touched the banister of the main staircase and felt not just an impact, but a fall. A body thrown from a height, the rush of air, the specific orientation of the world turning sideways before the ground arrived. She picked up his reading glasses from the desk where he had left them and felt the burn again, the one on the left forearm. But this time she also felt the heat of the room it had happened in, smelled the smoke, heard the sound of a structure collapsing somewhere nearby, and beneath it all the driving imperative of a body moving towards something rather than away from it. He had been going into the fire, not escaping it. He had been reaching for someone. She did not tell him about the deepening. She recorded it instead in a notebook she kept in her room, locked in the nightstand drawer. The entries were clinical: date, object or contact type, wound received, duration, associated sensory detail. She wrote them in the same hand she used for cataloguing, precise, objective, the documentation of a phenomenon she did not yet understand but intended to. The library work continued. She was into the south wall now, the section devoted to natural history and medical texts, some of them old enough to predate germ theory. Inside a volume on anatomy published in 1762, she found a dried flower pressed between pages describing the musculature of the human hand. The flower was lavender. It was still fragrant, faintly, after more than 200 years, and when she touched it she felt something she had not felt before. Not a wound, but a warmth. Gentle, localized, centered in the palm of her right hand. The sensation of someone else's hand holding hers, fingers interlaced, the kind of grip that says I am here and I am not leaving, and this moment is enough. It lasted 3 seconds. When it faded, she was crying, and she did not know why, except that the warmth had been so specific and so careful, and so clearly the memory of being touched by someone who meant it, that her body had responded before her mind could intervene. She found Elias in the garden that evening. He was kneeling beside a bed of roses, the old variety, the kind that bloom once and pour everything they have into the single effort. His hands were in the soil. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow and she could see his forearms, the left one marked by a scar she had felt from the inside, a ridge of pale tissue that ran from wrist to elbow in a line so straight it could only have been made by a blade. She sat down beside him, not close enough to touch. The distance they had negotiated, 3 feet, the width of an outstretched arm, the space that said, "I am choosing to be near you rather than I am requiring your nearness." And she told him about the lavender, about the warmth, about the hand. He stopped working, his fingers curled into the soil and held there, and she watched him process what she had said with the particular stillness of a man who has spent centuries learning that the first reaction is rarely the right one. He told her the lavender was Odette's. She had pressed it there herself, in the anatomy text, because she said that every book about the body should contain at least one reminder that the body was also capable of tenderness. He said he had forgotten which book it was in. He said he had forgotten a great deal about her, over time, because memory was not designed for the kind of duration he had been given, and the things that remained were not always the things he would have chosen to keep. But the hand, he said, the hand he remembered, the way she held his hand when the healing was happening. When the wound was closing and the pain was at its worst, she would hold his hand and press her thumb into the center of his palm, and he would focus on that single point of pressure until the rest of it passed. He said he could still feel the shape of her thumb if he thought about it, which he tried not to do, because some memories are not comforts but debts. Maren did not reach for him, she wanted to. The want was physical, pressing, a gravitational pull that she recognized as new and unfamiliar and possibly dangerous, in the way that all genuine desire is dangerous to a person who has learned to survive by wanting nothing. She sat beside him in the garden with her hands in her own lap, and she said that the warmth had not felt like a debt, it had felt like a gift, left inside a book for someone to find, centuries later, without any expectation of return. He looked at her then the way he had looked at the window that night in the kitchen, at a distance that was also a wall, except this time the wall had a crack in it, and through the crack she could see something she had only felt before in phantom, the landscape of a man who had been alone so long that the word alone had stopped meaning a condition and started meaning an identity, and someone was suggesting gently, from the other side of a distance neither of them had chosen, that identities could change. The external threat arrived on a Wednesday, and it arrived wearing a face she recognized. Caleb's car was in the lane when she came back from the village. She had walked to the post office, the first time she had left the estate grounds in 3 weeks, the first time she had moved through public space with her shoulders down rather than braced. And when she returned, the blue sedan was parked beside the stone wall, and the engine was still running, and she stopped walking because her body remembered before her mind did. The body remembers everything. It remembers the pitch of an engine, the specific shade of blue, the angle of a side mirror adjusted by a particular hand. Maren's body assembled these details into a composite in under 2 seconds, and delivered a single conclusion: he found you. She did not run. She had learned across 2 years and 4 months of precise and escalating education that running triggered pursuit, and pursuit triggered the worst of him. She walked. She kept her pace even and her breathing deliberate, and she walked toward the house because the house had a lock on the inside, and the house had Elias, and the house was the first place in her adult life that she had associated with the word safe, and she would not lose it by running from it. Caleb was on the front steps. He looked the way he always looked after one of her departures. Concerned, controlled, the mask so well crafted that a stranger would see only a worried boyfriend and miss entirely the architecture of ownership beneath the worry. He said her name. He said he had been looking for her. He said he just wanted to talk. She told him to leave. Her voice was steady. That steadiness cost her something she could measure. She could feel the effort in her throat, in the muscles of her diaphragm, in the specific tremor she was suppressing in her hands. But the voice came out even, and she said the words, and for the first time in 2 years and 4 months, she did not add a qualifier or an apology or a softening clause designed to prevent the reaction that always followed when she said what she meant. He did not leave. He stepped closer. He said things, reasonable things, arranged in reasonable order, delivered in the reasonable tone that had always been his most effective weapon, because reason is difficult to refuse when the person wielding it has convinced you that your own perception is the unreliable one. He said she owed him a conversation. He said she had left without warning. He said he had a right to know where she was and whether she was safe. The door behind him opened and Elias was there. Maren did not know how he knew. She had not called out. She had not pressed the bell in the hallway. But he was there, in the doorway, and his expression was the one she had not seen before. Not the careful neutrality, not the quiet warmth, but something older and less refined. His eyes were on Caleb with the particular attention of a man who has seen the species of harm that lives in reasonable voices and well-constructed sentences, and who recognizes it the way a doctor recognizes a disease, by the shape of it, by the pattern, by what it does to the person standing in front of it. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. He stepped out of the doorway and stood behind Maren, not in front of her, not between her and Caleb, but behind, the way a wall stands behind a person, present, immovable, implying nothing that needed to be spoken. He told Caleb that the woman standing in front of him had asked him to leave and that he should do so. He said it once. He did not repeat it. Caleb looked at Elias the way predators look at something they cannot categorize, not afraid, not yet, but recalculating. Something in Elias's presence resisted the usual calculations, the age that could not be placed, the stillness that was not passivity but restraint, the body language of a man who had survived enough violence to recognize its precursors and had decided, centuries ago, that he would never be the one to initiate it, but would not look away from it either. Caleb left. He got in his car and he drove down the lane, and the sound of the engine faded, and Maren stood on the steps and felt the cold air against the sweat on her neck and understood, with the clinical precision of a woman who had survived by reading every room for threat, that what had just happened was the most frightening moment of the last 3 weeks and also the safest. She turned to Elias and said thank you, and the words were inadequate, but they were all she had. And he nodded and held the door open for her and did not touch her, and did not ask questions, and followed her inside at a distance of exactly 3 feet, and closed the door behind them both, and engaged the lock, the heavy one, the iron one, the one that had not been used since she arrived. And the sound of it was the sound of a decision made jointly by 2 people who had not discussed it. That night she could not sleep again. But this time it was not fear, and it was not the new unnamed attention. It was rage. Clean, bright, focused rage at the fact that 2 years and 4 months of her life had been given to a man who removed deadbolts and called it love, and that she had come to this house as a transaction, a survival calculation, and what she had found here, the flowers, the distances, the lock on the inside of every door, was everything he had promised and never delivered. The comparison burned, not because Elias was perfect, or because the arrangement was romantic, or because she had confused safety for desire. It burned because the difference was so clear and so obvious and so damning that she could not believe it had taken her this long to see it. She pressed her hand flat against the wall beside her bed and felt the house pulse. His heartbeat, steady and ancient and threaded through it now, like a new instrument joining an orchestra she had been listening to for weeks. Something else. Not pain, not memory. Something present and alive and directed at her, at the fact of her in this house, at the sound of her breathing 3 floors above him in a room with a lock she controlled, and the feeling was so quiet and so careful and so deliberate that she almost missed it beneath the louder rhythm of her own anger. It was relief, his relief, that she was still here, that the car had driven away and she had walked back inside and the lock had turned and she was still here. She felt it settle into her chest beside her own heartbeat, and she let it stay. The days after Caleb's visit were different, not because anything had been declared. Nothing had, and Maren was grateful for the absence of declarations, which in her experience had always preceded the withdrawal of whatever had been declared, but because the architecture of the house had shifted. Small things. The distance between them at meals shrank from 3 feet to 2. He began leaving the study door open when she worked in the library, and sometimes she could hear him turning pages, the small rasp of old paper under careful fingers, and the sound became a kind of companionship that required nothing from either of them except willingness to be heard. She touched his things more often now, not deliberately, or perhaps deliberately, in the way that a person who has learned to want again makes choices that feel automatic but are not. She picked up his teacup from the desk when he left it behind and felt a night in 1724 when he stood on the deck of a ship and watched a city burn across a harbour and did nothing because there was nothing to be done. And the helplessness was the worst wound of all, worse than blade or fire or the long, slow damage of silver, because a wound that comes from inability rather than impact has no scar to show for it and no story to make it bearable. She touched the spines of the books he had annotated in centuries of marginal notes, his handwriting changing as the decades passed, tightening, loosening, adopting and discarding flourishes. The penmanship a record of cultural context, the way rings in a tree are a record of weather, and she felt through each one a fragment of whatever he had been feeling when his hand was on that page. Curiosity, mostly. The deep, patient curiosity of a mind that had been given more time than it knew what to do with and had decided, at some point, that learning was the only activity that did not become unbearable with repetition. And once, touching a volume of poetry she found on his bedside table, she had been changing the flowers in the upstairs rooms, a task she had taken over without discussion, the way she had taken over the soup and the kitchen and the particular angle at which the curtains were tied back in the mornings. She felt something that stopped her mid-step. Joy, brief, startled, almost involuntary, like the first note of a song the body remembers before the mind does. The joy of a specific morning. She could feel the sunlight on his face, the temperature of the air, the angle of light that only happens in late spring, when the sun is still low enough to enter through east-facing windows at a slant that turns everything gold. And in the joy, the specific pleasure of hearing footsteps. Overhead, her footsteps, the sound of her moving through his house in the morning, alive and present and choosing to be there, and the joy he felt at this sound was so unguarded and so helpless and so clearly something he had not expected to feel. Ever again that it broke something open inside her that she had not known was still closed. She set the book down. She sat on the edge of his bed, the first time she had entered his room, the first time she had crossed that particular threshold, and she pressed her hands against the bedspread and felt the accumulated history of every night he had spent in this room alone, and the single unprecedented fact of a morning when he woke and heard someone else's footsteps and was glad. She found him in the library. It was evening. The lamp was on. He was in his chair, the one in the west corner where the light fell correctly, and he had a book open on his knee, but he was not reading. He was looking at the place where she usually sat, the desk beside the east window where she did her cataloguing, and the expression on his face was the one she had felt through the book of poetry. Quiet, unguarded, the face of a man who has been alone for so long that he has stopped performing solitude and just lives inside it, and who is now looking at the place where someone else sits every day, and the place is empty, and the emptiness is the newest and most frightening thing in his house. She walked in, she sat down, not at the desk, in the chair beside his, a chair that had never been used, as far as she could tell, a chair that existed in the room the way furniture exists in houses too large for their occupants, present without purpose, until someone sits in it and gives it a reason. She told him she had felt his joy. She said it plainly, the way he had told her about Odette and the lavender, and the years that memory could not hold. She said she had touched his book and felt the morning and the sunlight and the sound of her own footsteps above him and the gladness that came with it, and she wanted him to know that she knew, because carrying knowledge like that alone felt like the kind of wound she had spent her whole life letting other people inflict, and she was not willing to do it to him. He closed his book. He set it on the table beside the lamp. His hands were the hands she had studied for weeks, long-fingered, scarred across the knuckles, steady in the way that centuries of practice make a body steady, every movement the product of intention rather than instinct. He placed them on his knees and looked at her and said her name, just her name, Marin. The way a person says a word they have been holding in their mouth for a long time, tasting the shape of it, getting used to the weight. He told her he had not felt joy like that in over 100 years. He said it had arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning when she was walking across the upstairs hallway, humming something he did not recognize, and the sound of her humming had landed in the silence of his house, like a match landing in a room that had been dark for so long. He had forgotten it was dark, and the light it produced was so sudden and so total that he had stood in his doorway and held onto the frame, because his body did not know what to do with an emotion it had not carried since 1919. She asked what had happened in 1919. He shook his head. Not now, he said. Maybe later, maybe in a month or a year or a decade, if she was still here. The if was light. The lightness was deliberate. He was offering her the door again, the way he always did, the way the contract had offered it, the way the lock on the inside of every room offered it, the consistent, patient, unrequired reminder that she could leave. She said she planned to be here. The words landed and neither of them moved. The lamp hummed. The library held them in its particular silence, the silence of 10,000 books and 300 years of solitude, and one evening in late spring, when two people sat in chairs that were closer together than they had been that morning. She reached across the distance between them and placed her hand on his, palm to knuckles. The contact was full and open, and she chose it with her eyes open. The wounds came, all of them, the complete catalogue, the way it had arrived on the first day, blade and fire and fall and silver, and the slow, corrosive damage of decades spent alone in rooms where no one ever sat in the second chair. But this time she was ready. This time she did not pull away. She breathed through it the way she breathed through the memory of deadbolts and coffee cups and the precise sound of keys. Not by pushing it away, but by letting it move through her, the way water moves through a channel, the way grief moves through a body that has finally stopped clenching against it. And on the other side of the pain, like a city on the other side of a storm, the rest of it arrived, not just wounds, everything. The morning in a garden in Lyon when a woman with calloused hands told him that his blood under a microscope was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. the afternoon in an unnamed forest when he lay on his back and watched the canopy move above him and felt, for no reason and without cause, that being alive was worth the cost. The night, 100 nights, 1,000, when the moon was full and the house was quiet and the loneliness was so deep and so familiar that it had become a kind of companionship, the most reliable presence in his life, and he had stood in this very room, and spoken to it as if it were a person, because even solitude deserves to be acknowledged. And the morning, the Tuesday morning, the sound of her footsteps, the humming, the joy that arrived like something uncaged, wild and startled and so fiercely alive that it frightened him, because joy after a century of absence is not gentle. It is violent, it is radical. It is the body remembering an emotion it had classified as dead and discovering it was only dormant, only waiting, only needing the right sound to break through 100 years of frost. Maren held his hand and felt all of it, and the tears on her face were not pain. They were the particular overwhelm of being given someone's entire history in a language that cannot be paraphrased or softened or made polite. The raw, unmediated transmission of what it costs to survive and what it means to be glad. Finally, that you did. He turned his hand beneath hers, palm to palm, his fingers closed around hers the way Odette's had once closed around his, with the specific pressure in the center of the palm, the thumb finding the place where the pulse lives, closest to the surface, the grip that says, I am here and the rest of it can wait. She felt his heartbeat through his hand, that slow, ancient, impossible rhythm that had been the baseline of her nights for weeks. And she felt her own, quick and human and mortal. And between them, in the space where two pulses overlapped, something new, not his heartbeat, not hers. Something they were making together, a third rhythm, a frequency that only existed because two people had chosen, in a room full of books and lamplight and 300 years of earned solitude, to hold on. He said her name again, she said his. The exchange was not poetic. It was not a declaration. It was the simplest possible acknowledgement. I know who you are, I know what you carry, I am not leaving. Delivered in the only language that two people who have both survived more than they should have can trust. The language of names, the language of presence, the language of a hand held open, not reaching, not pulling, just there, just available, just choosing to remain. The library was quiet, the lamp hummed. Somewhere in the garden, the roses Elias had planted in a century she would never visit were blooming their single annual bloom, pouring everything into the one effort. And the scent of them came through the window that he had opened earlier that evening, perhaps without thinking, perhaps with exactly the kind of thinking he had spent centuries perfecting. The small, unrequired act performed without expectation, leaving a window open so the night air could carry something beautiful into a room where two people sat together. She did not let go of his hand, he did not let go of hers. The pain was there beneath the warmth, the way the foundation of a house is there beneath the room you live in, present, structural, necessary, the thing that holds everything else up. She could feel every wound he had ever survived, and she could feel the life that had accumulated around the wounds, and the life was larger. The life was so much larger. She had come to this house as a transaction. She had stayed as a choice, and the choice, made quietly, in a room with a lock on the inside and a window open to the garden and a man whose hand fit around hers as if the centuries had been shaping it for this specific purpose, was the first thing she had wanted in years. That was not survival. It was enough. It was so much more than enough. It was the particular miracle of two people who had been hurt enough to stop hoping, choosing on an ordinary evening in an extraordinary house to hope anyway. Not because the evidence supported it, not because the odds were favorable, but because the alternative, The locked rooms, the empty chairs, the hearts that beat alone in houses too large for one person, was no longer bearable, now that they had heard what it sounded like to be accompanied. The lamp hummed, the roses bloomed, the house breathed its slow, ancient breath, and inside it, for the first time in 300 years, the silence was not solitude. It was two people, sitting together, who had chosen this.